Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's jump right in to study some Jewish history together. So I think this week is an apropos time for the subject we're discussing. We're continuing on with the story of the interbellum period, the period right before World War II, and the rise of Hitler and Nazism throughout Europe. And this week's Torah reading is Parshas Kisavo, which has within it the tochacha, the curses, the admonishments to the Jewish people. Moshe warns the Jewish people, if you follow the ways of the Torah and listen to Hashem, so to speak, we'll have all kinds of blessing and wonderful things. And if we don't, God forbid, then the protection of Hashem will be removed from the Jewish people, and it will allow all the terrible forces in the world to affect the Jewish people. That's Parshas Kisavo. And I remember I had one of my Rebbeim, Rabbi Avram Rockmill, used to say that the question of where was God in Auschwitz didn't bother him because he understood Parshas Kisavo, its parallel in Parshas Bechukosai, which has these curses, and it laid out pretty clearly the forces that are available in the world, and that without the protection of Hashem, what is possible for the Jewish people. So he said he wasn't bothered by the philosophical question that is often risen in reference to the Holocaust. But really, there's a story I want to share with you. This story I once heard from my dear friend and mentor, Rabbi Pesach Krohn, and it really encapsulates this idea in a beautiful way. This war is about the great Klosenberger Rebbe, Rav Yekusiel Yehuda Halberstam, who was a survivor of Auschwitz. He was actually in many death camps, and not only was he a survivor, but he lost his entire family. His wife and 11 children from before the war did not survive. They were killed by the Nazis, Yimach Shemam. And during the time that he was incarcerated in the concentration camps, his entire focus was on doing whatever he could to strengthen any Jew he came in contact with. Now, after the war, he resettled any of his Hasidim that survived in the Brooklyn area of New York. Now, the year was 1952. They had just arrived in New York, just set up their new synagogue, and it was this week's Parsha, the reading of Parshas Kisavo and the reading of the Teichacha, the curses found within. Now, Jewish tradition mandates that when the Torah reader comes up to the sixth Aliyah, which has within it the admonitions, he does it in a low voice, as if to say it's part of the Torah, we've got to read it, but it's to show that we're not so enthusiastic about the section. Now, as per the custom, the man reading the Torah that day did so in a soft voice, almost a whisper. Rabbi Halberstam, the Rebbe, standing at the front from his shtinder, clapped and said in Yiddish, Heicher, louder. So the man reading the Torah assumed that the old Rebbe maybe couldn't hear his Torah reading in the low voice that he was reading it in. So he continued on just a little bit louder than the way he read it before, but still in a much lower voice than what was normal. Once again, the Rebbe gave a clap on his shtinder and screamed out in a Yiddish voice. He said, I said louder. Read these verses out loud. We have nothing to fear. We've already experienced the curses. Let the master of the universe hear them. Let him know that the curses have already befallen us. And let him know that it's time for him to send the blessing. The Rebbe then turned his face towards the wall of the synagogue, while the Torah reader continued reading in a loud voice, chanting the curses as if it was a normal section of the Torah to the stunned congregation. After the Torah reading, the Rebbe went in front of the congregation and said, My beloved brothers and sisters, pack up your belongings. We must make one more move, hopefully the last one. God promised that the blessings which must follow the curses will now come. They will come, but not for America. The blessings will only come from Israel. It is time for us to go. And true to his word, the Rebbe and all of his Hasidim made a move to the land of Israel, and they founded the Kiryat Sanz community in Netanya 8 years later in 1960. Now, the Talmud tells a story at the end of Makos that Rabbi Akiva and a number of sages were traveling to Jerusalem, and this was after the destruction of the Second Temple. And they ascended Mount Scopus, and looking down on the Temple Mount from there, they saw foxes coming out of the place where the Holy of Holies once stood. Now, all the sages started crying, except for Rabbi Akiva, who laughed. The sages turned to Rabbi Akiva and said, Akiva, why are you laughing? To which point he retorted in classical Jewish form with the question, why are you crying? And they said, quoting the verse in Bamidbar, and the non-priest who approaches shall die, meaning the only person who's allowed in the Holy of Holies is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and only on Yom Kippur. And now we see foxes walking out of it? Why shouldn't we weep? So Rabbi Akiva said to him, that is precisely why I'm laughing. Because in the prophecy of Uriah, it teaches us, therefore for your sake, Zion shall be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become rubble, and the Temple Mount as the high places of a forest, which is where foxes live. In the prophecy of Zechariah, it's written, there shall yet be elderly men and women, there shall yet be elderly men and women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem. Says Rabbi Akiva, until the prophecy of the destruction was fulfilled, I was afraid that the prophecy of redemption would not be fulfilled. Now that we've seen the destruction, we can now see the redemption. And to which all the sages responded to him, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. So as we study the story of the Holocaust, the prelude, the actual Holocaust, the aftermath, it is the story of Parshas Kisavo. It is the story of the Tochacha, the rebuke of the Jewish people. But we should read it, not necessarily like the Kloisenberger Rebbe did, but we should read it with a certain confidence, knowing that Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, have already gone through this curse. We already experienced every single one of the 63 verses of the Tochacha. Our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents lived through that already. And just like that came true, to a T, we know that the blessings found within the Torah will also come true to a T, and we should all see it happen speedily in our day. That's by way of introduction as we continue the story of the Tochacha, the story of the rise of Hitlerism in Eastern Europe. So last week we discussed the rise of Hitler from a vagabond in Vienna to becoming the dictator of Germany. By 1934, he had completely consolidated his power. He was both the chancellor and the president, now called himself the Führer, and was also the army had given over allegiance to him as well. Complete control of the German people at this point. Everything else was just there to rubber stamp the will of this one insane man. Right as he's elected to after he consolidates his power, he rejects the Treaty of Versailles and he began the rearmament of Germany. He withdrew from the League of Nations and he withdrew from the World Disarmament Conference, sending a loud signal to the world that Germany was going to do something different for the world. Now, in March of 1935, he announced that he was expanding the Wehrmacht, the German army, to 600,000 soldiers, which was 6 times greater than the Treaty of Versailles allowed. And he was also adding the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, and the Kriegsmarine, the Navy. So he was true to his word through his military expansion. Now, the next step of Hitler's rise was Germany went to reoccupy the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland in March of 1936. Now, all this happened, no more Treaty of Versailles, rearmament, reoccupying and reclaiming the lands taken away from Germany as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And you know what the Allies did? Absolutely nothing. Okay, Russia, we're maybe not expecting so much from them, but France and England, sit there and watch. Now, they gave stern warnings, but those stern warnings were backed up by absolutely nothing. And you know, Hitler was we can say a lot of things about Hitler, but one thing for sure is he was not an idiot. And each step of the way, he doesn't just make these steps in a vacuum. He would take the step and put his ear to the ground and listen. Take a step and put his ear out to listen. And each time he was, so to speak, calling the bluff of the nations of the world up until 1939. But for 6 years, there was no response to anything that he does. And finally, in 1939, the response is almost too late. Because by that point, he's almost ready to take over all of Europe, and almost does. In November 1936, he makes his axis with Italy, and Mussolini is actually the one who came up with the term Axis, and as the world now calls it, the Axis of Evil, but that began in 1936. On March 12, 1938, Hitler announces the unification of Austria with Nazi Germany in what's called the Anschluss. And again, without a shot being fired, without a tank being used, Austria becomes part of the German Empire. And after that, he turns his focus to the German population of the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, which is probably about 20-25% of the country of Czechoslovakia at that point. And at this point, the nation's like, they start to get a little nervous, not nervous enough, but they start to get a little nervous. And Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, reaches out to Hitler. He wants to meet with Hitler. He wants to see if they can come to some sort of accommodation with Hitler, some sort of appeasement with Hitler. And on October 1st, 1938, as a result of their meetings, the Munich Agreement is signed. And in the Munich Agreement, the Britain and France agree not to hold Germany accountable for annexing the Sudetenland to Czechoslovakia. By the way, Czechoslovakia had no say in any of this, right? The Czechoslovakian prime minister was not happy with any of this, but he had no say. And Britain agrees that they're going to essentially let Germany annex part of Czechoslovakia, about 20% of Czechoslovakia. And in return, they will have peace. They will not go to war. Hitler agrees that now that he has Austria and the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, that's what he meant by Lebensraum. That's what he meant by this area that he needed for the German people to expand. And Neville Chamberlain goes back to Britain and claims, waving the Munich Agreement in hands, that we have peace for our time. And how deadly wrong was he? Right? Neville Chamberlain, from this point forward, becomes the example of the failures of appeasement in the world. By the way, President Biden, and I don't like to get political here today, but President Biden, look at Neville Chamberlain before you sit down and try and make an Iran deal with Iran. Okay? Just take a look at history. Neville Chamberlain, enough said. Okay. And that's what's happening in as far as the Allies. That's about all they do before Germany invades Poland. Now, one of the interesting things about the Nazis at this point, during these 6 years from the rise of Hitler, from Hitler coming to power until the beginning of World War II, is that Hitler wanted clearly to get rid of the Jews of Germany and any German-controlled lands. Now, what wasn't clear and what is debated by historians is if Hitler already had in mind the concept of the final solution, or if that was something that came about later. Lucy Davidovitz, in her book, The War Against the Jews, 1933 to 1945, she claims that he did. And she looks to a line in Mein Kampf in which Hitler says, if we had only been able to gas 15,000 Jews in World War I, we would have won the war. Something to that effect. And she looks at that as an idea that all of Hitler's ranting about getting rid of the Jews of Europe, that he was ready and willing and able to gas the Jews of Europe, to exterminate the Jews of Europe. That being said, the Germans really kept their whole planning of the final solution under very quiet terms, always only referring to it through different euphemisms and different metaphors and whatnot. So it's very hard to reverse engineer it to say at what point did the Nazi regime come up with the concept of the final solution. But what seems clear before the onset of World War I, and really until the final solution is fully kicked into play, is that he definitely wanted to get rid of the Jews of Europe and was willing to do whatever he could to do it. Now, initially, there were definitely those within the Nazi party that thought the idea of Zionism was going to be their means to get rid of the Jews of Germany and of Europe. And there were actually early negotiations between the Nazis and the Zionist movement trying to get the German Jews to Palestine, to the land of Israel. Now, eventually we're going to see that does not become the plan, and we'll see part of the reason why. But in these early 6 years of the Nazi regime, a lot of the effort, while we're going to see there are many brutal pogroms taken out on the Jewish community, and many Jews are murdered during this time, there's also going to be many efforts just to get the Jews out of Germany. Now, part of what Hitler and the Nazis had to do to succeed is that anti-Semitism it's in the mother's milk of really the non-Jewish world. It's for sure in the mother's milk of the Christian world. There's a wonderful book I'm reading right now, given to me by my dear friend Stu Garson, called Constantine's Sword, where he goes through the history of anti-Semitism within the church and how it really started with, arguable at what point, but definitely by Constantine and the 3rd century, the concept of Christian hatred of the Jew was firmly established. And the illogical conclusion, if you will, of all that is the Holocaust. So the what we'll call cultural anti-Semitism was latent throughout Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe. No matter what, if you've been listening the past number of weeks, it was there for everybody. But Hitler's anti-Semitism took it to a new level. The cultural anti-Semite didn't want to associate with the Jew, didn't want to work with the Jew, didn't want the Jew to be a member of his club. They wanted to be able to beat up the Jew and have a pogrom here and there, but that was the extent of it. To upgrade, so to speak, the cultural anti-Semite to the Nazi anti-Semite took some work. So that's what the Nazis are working on during this time. Really, again, putting their ear to the ground, and as every anti-Semitic step they would take, they would see how much the world would let them do and how much the German people would let them do. And through that, he is able to convert the cultural anti-Semite to be a Nazi anti-Semite. Now, the actions against Jews started with, they hit them where it hurt, so to speak, in the pocketbook. And the actions were taken against certain jobs that first they were not allowed to, slowly but surely, any of the jobs that Jews had, at the white-collar jobs, government jobs, doctors, lawyers, accountants, etc., those are the jobs that are eliminated for Jews at first, relegating Jews to be part of the working class yet again. Now, the big step that we always refer to, actually the anniversary of this was just yesterday, is in 1935 what we refer to as the Nuremberg Laws. Now, the Nuremberg Laws had really two parts to them. There was the law of the protection of German blood and German honor, which it's actually interesting from sort of the 30,000-foot view. We agree with this law, because what did it do? It forbade marriage and extramarital intercourse between Jews and Germans. That we agree with. I had no issue. The motivation obviously was terrible, but the law itself, I agree Jews should marry non-Jews and Jews shouldn't have extramarital intercourse with non-Jews. I agree with that. The second part of that law was that the employment of German females under the age of 45 was not allowed in Jewish households. So that meant that a German woman, an Aryan woman, could not be a cook, a maid, a nanny, a nurse, whatever it is, could not work in a Jewish household. Part of the mindset here, or really the full mindset here, was that the Nazis accused the Jews constantly of promiscuous behaviors. And to take that to law, so to speak, they were saying that no single lady, 45 or younger, I guess once they become middle-aged, my age or older, then they're not as worried, but couldn't be in a Jewish home. Okay. That was the first law. That was the law for the protection of German blood and German honor. Now, the second law that took place, that we lumped together, the Nuremberg Laws. Now, it's called the Nuremberg Laws because they were announced at a rally in Nuremberg. The second, Nuremberg is where the Nazis' headquarters were, by the way. The second law was the Reich citizenship law. Now, this was much more nefarious, and what it said is that only those Germans or related blood were eligible to be Reich citizens. In other words, Jews were now people without a state. In other words, German Jews were no longer Germans. They could no longer refer to themselves as German Jews, not in writing, not in speech, not at all. They could only refer to them as Jews, like Jews residing in Germany. But they can no longer refer to themselves as Germans. Now, again, we have to just point out some of the ironies of history, especially in focus of this week's parsha with Kisavo and the curses and the Jewish people, so to speak, rebelling against the Almighty. The Reform movement in their early platforms said clearly that we don't look at ourselves as Jews, as Israelis, as Bnei Yisrael. We look at ourselves as Germans of Jewish persuasion, or German of the Mosaic tradition, or something like that. Germans first, Jews second. So it's interesting that the first of the laws that the Nazis make against the Jews is say, nope, can't call yourself German anymore. Okay, that's the Nuremberg Laws. 1936, Jews are banned from all professional jobs, meaning whatever they had been banned from before, okay, that was level 1. Now level 2 is any white-collar, any professional job, so to speak, Jews were banned from. Okay? Now, at this point, there's an event that I think it's not widely talked about because it brings up the question that we're going to discuss in these coming sessions of where were the Allies, America, England, France. Well, France, we know what happens with them. They ceased to exist shortly after the beginning of the war. But where were America and England with everything that was going on? Did they not know what Hitler was doing? Did the world not know? The famous question that we'll get to of why were the tracks of Auschwitz not bombed by the Allies? And I think that because of that question that is a mark really on the Americans and the British, the conference that takes place in 1938 is often is often not talked about. Now, the conference I'm referring to is known as the Evian Conference, and it's held July 6th through 15th in Evian, France. And it's a conference in which world leaders come together to try to discuss what to do about the Jewish problem. Now, it's interesting that when Hitler finds out about this conference, he says, and I quote, "I can only hope and expect that the other world," meaning not the Nazi world, "which has such deep sympathies for these criminals, the Jews, will at least be generous enough to convert their sympathies into practical aid. We, on our part, are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries. For all I care, even on luxury ships." That's what Hitler had to say about the Evian Conference. So the Evian Conference was focused on what to do about the Jewish problem, the refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, and it was actually inspired by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president. But it's interesting because historians are pretty clear that even though it was the brainchild of FDR, this was a time of American isolationism. This was a time that the Immigration Act of 1924 was still in place. These Jews could not come to America so easily. And therefore, many historians believe that he was trying to find another country in the world to take the burden of the Jewish problem, to take the world's Jews, because America wasn't going to take them. And not only that, but Roosevelt and Chamberlain actually had a pact before this conference. What was the pact? That America would not bring up the concept of Jews going to Palestine as long as Britain didn't bring up the concept of Jews coming to America. In other words, Britain and America got together beforehand and said, we're going to have this conference, try and figure out what to do about the Jewish problem, the Jews fleeing from it. This was just Germany, but will it become the Jews fleeing from all of Europe or trying to get out of Europe? But you know what? We want them to Israel because that's under British control, and we want them to America. We'll find some other country to take them. Well, needless to say, the conference was doomed from the beginning, and the representatives there are 32 countries represented, 24 humanitarian organizations. Actually, Golda Meir was there as part of it, and she was representing the British Mandatory Palestine, but she was not allowed to speak or participate. That was a rule. She could be there, but she couldn't participate or speak. Now, So you can imagine kind of what happened at this conference. And sure enough, the only countries that make a significant commitment to take in the Jews of Europe, or at this point just Germany, but will become the Jews of Europe, was the tiny country of the Dominican Republic and the tiny country of Costa Rica. And that is it. Out of every other country that was represented there, they basically said, we also don't want the Jews. And the conference ended up becoming a major PR piece for the Nazi regime. Because the Nazis could now look at this Evian conference and say, see, nobody wants the Jews. Nobody wants them. So no one cares about them, right? Forget about the Jews. And who the soon-to-become first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, said about the conference, the world seemed to be divided into two parts. Those places where the Jews could not live and those where they could not enter. And therefore, it's really the Evian Conference, I believe, that gives Hitler his pretext for the final solution. November 7th, 1938, a young Polish Jew living in France by the name of Herschel Greenspan attacks and shoots two German officials in the Nazi Germany embassy in Paris, one of which eventually dies. Now, what motivated Greenspan to do this? Greenspan was of Polish descent, as was his family. Now, his parents and siblings lived in Hanover, Germany. And the situation was becoming increasingly precarious under Nazi rule. His father's business had already fallen apart. And the Polish government had already made a law that any Polish citizen living outside of Poland could no longer have Polish citizenship. And the Germans responded making a similar decree by saying essentially any expat that's in Germany can't be here anymore. So what happened, this was all a pretext for the Germans to be able to ship any Jew of Polish descent outside of Poland. The only problem was they couldn't get back into Poland because their Polish citizenship had already been canceled. Some of the people affected by this were the Greenspans. And what happened to those people is that 12,000 Polish Jews were arrested, stripped of their property, and herded in boxcars off towards the Polish border, where they, and in the end, they were also forced to walk about a mile to the Polish no man's land, basically between Germany and Poland. Poland refuses to admit them. Germany obviously won't let them back. Anyone who tries to escape back to Germany is shot by the Gestapo. And this is how these people are being treated. The Red Cross tries to come to their aid. The accommodations are terrible, and many die of hunger and disease out of these 12,000 Polish Jews. Now, mind you, this is before, long before, not long before, but before concentration camps. So Greenschmann's sister sends him a postcard in Paris describing what had happened to the family. And really in a state of exacerbation over what has happened to his family, he takes action. The postcard arrived on November 3rd. He perpetrated his shooting on November 7th. One of the embassy officials dies on November 8th. And what happens November 9th? Kristallnacht as a response. Kristallnacht is the famous or infamous pogrom where Jewish shops and synagogues are ransacked, burnt to the ground, destroyed in every way possible. And it's looked at really as the line in the sand, the first major pogrom of the Nazis against the Jews. Many Jews were killed on that night. Many Jews were arrested and taken to the concentration camps, which had death camps weren't there yet, but the concentration camps were already there. Buchenwald, Dachau being the first one, and that was really, we look at that as the line of the sand. Even though the war doesn't begin for another year, we look at November 9th, 1938, the night of which actually ends up becoming my parents' anniversary, some 25 years later. But we look at 35 years later. We look at Kristallnacht as the line in the sand between really the pre-war Germany and the Holocaust. Now, the icing on the cake comes in May 1939, where the British issued their infamous White Paper, which completely barred Jewish immigration to Palestine. So when we look at the situation now, there were 500,000 Jews in Germany in 1933. About 300,000 are going to be able to get out in these first 6 years, leaving about 200,000 on the eve of World War II, and most of those don't survive. But it's interesting, though, that really percentage-wise, that's a large number compared to a lot of the other countries in Europe where the Jews aren't going to have a chance to leave once the Nazis come into power. And really the ongoing question becomes, even for those, it's really remarkable when you think about it that 60% did get out, because where could they go, right? Where did they go? And all those 600,000, all those 300,000 have a story of how they managed to go somewhere, how they snuck into Israel, how they had family in America, they went to Australia, Canada, South Africa, wherever. They're all crazy. Each one has a crazy story because we saw the world did not want the Jews. So, as next week, when we're going to really delve into the Holocaust, I think it's very important to keep in mind that, yes, the most guilty were the Nazis, Yimach Shemo. They led it all. But they brought out this anti-Semitism that was at least latent, I would say, in almost the whole world, including America. Now let's take a picture of America in the interbellum period. Now, when we talk about America and the Jewish experience in America, we at least now in 2022, it has to be talked about really from a place of 100% Hakaras HaTov. Yes, it's not perfect. Yes, there's a rise of anti-Semitism, and in New York they're threatening the yeshivas now, and etc. There's I'm not going to say there's not problems, but bottom line is that whatever we're going through now doesn't hold a candle to the shoelaces of the smallest toe of the smallest person compared to what we've gone through in our history. And this is by far the best experience we've had here in America since really the 1960s. We can do virtually anything now. We can be virtually anything now, and amazingly do it all without much compromise. I mean, think about it. Some fascinating books to read are the books that have been put out by the previous administration's team that dealt with the land of Israel and worked on the Abraham Accords and the Peace and Prosperity Plan. I'm referring to Ambassador David Friedman, his deputy Rivari Lightstone, and Jason Greenblatt. They've each written books, and they're all observant Jews, and they each wrote books describing their time working on these peace deals and working on the envoy in Israel, and just what's fascinating is, again, that each and every single one of them is Shomer Shabbos, keeps kosher, and was uncompromising in their roles. So it really shows as a Jew you can do just about anything. We always look at Senator Lieberman, who was Shomer Shabbos during his long tenure in the Senate and was even nominated and almost won the vice presidency of the United States. And that's really the situation we've come into. And, it's like for those who remember the old Virginia Slims commercial, you've come a long way, baby. Well, that's what it is. Because as we look at really the rise of the success of the Jew in America, it didn't come from nowhere. If we just even focus on politics for a minute. So the first Jew elected in America is actually in 1775 to the Provincial Congress. That's Francis Salvador in South Carolina, who's actually known as the Paul Revere of the South. There's a certain attack where he rode his horse to warn that the British were coming. But he's the first Jew elected to office in the New World. The first senator in 1845 from Florida was David Levy Yulee. But while he is in the Senate, he actually converts out of the religion. So the first practicing Jew was in 1853 from Louisiana and was none other than Judah P. Benjamin, who eventually became the treasurer and then the Secretary of State of the Confederacy. Now, when we look at the House of Representatives, 1845, again, same time period, we have Louis Charles Levin from Pennsylvania being the first Jew to be elected to the House of Representatives. 1881, we have David Emanuel, the first Jewish governor from the great state of Georgia, but like Yulee, the first senator, he actually was born a Jew but didn't practice. He converted out. So the first practicing Jew was actually Edward Solomon from Wisconsin. Now, the cabinet, that took a little bit longer. 1906, Oscar Strauss is the first Secretary of Commerce and Labor under Teddy Roosevelt. Then there's a gap until 1934 when Henry Morgenthau becomes the Secretary of the Treasury. And then there's another gap that not until 1961 where we see Arthur Goldberg as the Secretary of Labor. But from that point on, the floodgates were open. You always have a cabinet with many Jews. Today's presidential cabinet has 4 Jews in it. That's 1/6 of the cabinet. So if you think about the state of the Jew in America, we make up like less than 2% of the United States of America, yet we're 6% of the House of Representatives, 10% of the Senate, and 17% of the president's cabinet. Like we're disproportionately represented, and that's the Virginia Slims. Now this is only politics. Now if you look at business, you see the same exact thing. A snapshot from a couple sports leagues even. The National Football League, NFL, 9 out of 32 teams are owned by Jews. The National Basketball Association, the NBA, 13 out of 30 teams are owned by Jews. So, we really have come quite a long way in really a very short period of time because this opening for the Jews really doesn't start until after the 1960s. Like we said, when we saw the floodgates open with Jewish cabinet appointments, and that's really when the Jews start to sort of settle into a successful situation in America. But before that, when we look at the Jewish story, as we've talked about in the past number of weeks, Jews were here from the time of Christopher Columbus, from the time that Europeans started coming to America. We were part of the Revolutionary War in small numbers, part of the Civil War in slightly greater numbers. After the Civil War, there were about 200,000 Jews in America. Now, they were mostly of German descent and mostly assimilated. The small community of Orthodox Jews at that point were all, for the most part, Sephardic Jews. So that's what the Eastern Europeans found in America when they started to immigrate between 1880 and 1920, and when the immigration was shut off in the Immigration Act of 1924. So that 200,000 in 1880 becomes 4 million by 1924, with the combination of the 2.5 million Jewish immigrants from Russia and the birth rate combined of those 2.5 million as they came and the 200,000 that were already here. So in a very short period of time, we become really a force to reckon with in the country. Now that's 4 million out of 100 million. So that's at that point we were about 4% of the country. Today there's about 330 million Americans with only about 7 million Jews. So in the time that America has grown 3x, we've not even doubled yet. That's because of assimilation and low birth rate and assimilation. That's really the only reason, because thank God there hasn't been any Holocaust in America yet. But that's really the situation of the beginning of the beginning of the Jewish community in America comes with. So at this time period when the Jews are coming, really, like we said, until the 1960s, it's not the open anti-Semitism of the Romanovs, of the pogroms of Russia, and definitely not to the level that we're going to find under Nazi control. But those same sentiments that lead to that rise is also in America. Jokes, slurs, being beat up in the street. Jews couldn't hold many jobs. Jews couldn't get into many universities. In fact, the creation really of Jewish law firms was because Jews weren't allowed to join regular law firms, so they made their own law firms. they became some of the best law firms in the country. So too with the Jewish hospitals. Almost every city, no matter how small a Jewish community, even Louisville, Kentucky, has a Jewish hospital, or Mount Sinai Hospital. By the way, the reason why so many Jewish hospitals are called Mount Sinai, like it was here in Cleveland, like where my kids were born in Baltimore, like I think in Louisville it's Mount Sinai, is because there's a medrash that says when the Jews stood at Mount Sinai, everyone was healed of all their ailments. So that's why a lot of Jewish hospitals are called Mount Sinai. But really the creation of the Jewish hospital was really twofold. It was number one, because Jewish doctors couldn't get jobs in the other hospitals, and number two, the Jewish patients there wouldn't be an attempt to convert them on their deathbeds to Christianity. So this is the situation in America, really up until the 1960s. So the fact that when we look at us, where we've come in America, it's not from 1776, it's not from after the Civil War, it's really from 1960 on. It's really in the past 60 years, 60 plus years, that we've been able to really rise from the ashes that we brought over from Europe and become something. And it was during these difficult years before the 1960s where we saw a number of things happen. Number one, I have an article about this, a fascinating article, absolutely fascinating, as every article I write is. You can find it either on rabbilandis.com or on h.com, who publishes my articles. And it's an article about the concept of Jews changing their names. Now, there's a canard that has been passed down throughout the Jewish world that names were truncated at Ellis Island by the immigration officials, which is an absolute canard, absolutely false. If a Jew changed their name, they changed their name because they wanted to change their name, to hide their Jewishness, to get jobs, to deal with all this anti-Semitism that we're talking about here. That was my family's case. Our name was Lefkovich in Europe, and my grandfather, Oliver Shalom, shortened it to Landis. And he never told us the canard, but I used to think he was the exception until I found out that was really the rule, and there was just this story about names being changed at Ellis Island. Take a look at the article for more details on that. There's also another interesting concept besides the Jewish hospital, the Jewish law practice, the change of the names, the concept of the Jewish country club. Why were there Jewish country clubs? Because Jews couldn't get into the Goyish country clubs. Now, what's interesting, again, another interesting Jewish phenomenon, is that every major Jewish community, it seems, had two Jewish country clubs. Now, it wasn't just that this is a club I belong to, this is one I never stepped foot in. It was that, but it was really a little bit more insidious than that, is that the Jewish country clubs were started in the 19th century or before, as the German Jews came over and assimilated and wanted to assimilate and wanted to join the Goyish country clubs, but they couldn't, so they replicated them as Jewish country clubs. Now, 40 years later, when their Eastern European cousins start coming over, the Eastern Europeans who, predominantly spoke Yiddish, really didn't speak so much English that much, still had a lot of the trappings of the old world that the German Jews didn't even have in Germany. Well, they want to join the Jewish country clubs. They didn't want to join the Goyish ones. They knew better than that already. But they wanted to join the Jewish one. And the German Jews wouldn't let them. So all the Eastern European Jews went and started their own country clubs. And that's why, like where I grew up in Atlanta, there was a Standard Club and the Progressive Club. Here in Cleveland, there was Oakwood and Beachmont. And Cincinnati, where I used to live, there was the Los Santoville Club and the Ridge Club. And that's the story really of every city. You had the German club, and you had the Russian, and you had the Eastern European club. Now, what's interesting, with this huge influx of Russian Jewry, much of the political temperature of these Jews was left-leaning, and because they brought over the socialist ideas that had been fermenting in Russia at this time. And that's where Jews become Democrats. The Jewish community still votes heavily Democrat, probably anywhere from 60 to 70%. And but that was not the case before the 1900s. Before the 1900s, it was probably 70-30 the other way, and it wasn't really until FDR when it heavily swung to Jews voting Democrat. Okay, now it's waxed and waned over the past since FDR, but that's where it started. It was really the socialist ideas coming over from Russia with the Jews to America. And these Eastern European Jews, unlike the German Jews who come before them, were coming from Eastern Europe, whereas, as is often quoted, I think it's quoted from the Chavetz Chaim, I believe, or the Chavetz Chaim said, "You know why all the Jews of Radin keep Shabbos? Because all the Jews of Radin keep Shabbos." And it was the culture of Eastern Europe was Jews kept Shabbos. There was no such. Now, I don't want to say that didn't mean there weren't assimilated Jews. We did mention that the Haskalah had made its way to Eastern Europe as well, but for the most part, the overwhelming community was an observant community. Now, as they came over to America, yes, there were many stories of people throwing their tefillin in the Hudson and cutting off their beards on the boat and really making it clear they didn't want anything of Eastern European Jewry to make it with them in America. But there were those, probably the majority, who really wanted to keep Yiddishkeit alive, who wanted to keep the Yiddishkeit of Europe alive. But what they came to, we already have all this anti-Semitism. But on top of that, we had something new. It's for the first time we have Jews come in conflict with a 6 or 7 day work week. That was not the case in Europe. With all the anti-Semitism and pogroms and terrible things in Europe, that was not a challenge. It wasn't a challenge for the Jew to keep Shabbos in Europe. And, I always say that it's surprising now that it's such a challenge for people, because Shabbos is awesome. Like it's, taking a day, being able to turn off your phone, not be buzzed and pinged and tweeted at all day long, relax, hang out with your family, spend time together, rest. It's a beautiful thing. I don't know why everyone doesn't keep Shabbos nowadays. It's easy for us. But that was definitely not the case when Jews started coming to America, because if you did not work for yourself, as most of the Jewish community did not, there was a 6 or 7 day work week. And the way that it worked is that if you didn't show up on Shabbos, your boss would make it clear, well, don't show up on Monday either. And understandably, many, I would say most, could not withstand that pressure because poverty was rampant. The tenements of the Lower East Side, it was the same poverty that was with them in Europe had come over to America, and they couldn't. They had to eat. They had to support their family. Now, what's interesting is that, so just as a result of this, those who actually remained Shomer Shabbos were a minority. If you meet someone who says that their family is Shomer Shabbos going back to Europe, and they were here during that period between 1880 and 1960, then, get a bracha from them, get a blessing from them, because they were a holy person. I know with my family this was a story. When they came over from Europe in the 1880s, they were observant. And in America, before they had their own businesses, they couldn't do it. And there went Shabbos. Now, so number one, we can't judge those people at all. Like none of us could have stood that test. I don't know how I would stand that test if I had that test. But this is before all the social services. This is before food stamps. This is before Obamacare. This is before all that stuff. None of that existed. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. You didn't have healthcare. You didn't have anything. So definitely don't judge those people. And these people did make an effort to keep as much Yiddishkeit as they could. For example, the very popular concept in some communities is the concept of Hashkama minyan, the early minyan on Shabbos. There's a lot of people who like to get up early even on Shabbos, daven at whatever it is, 7:30 minyan. And that way they daven at 7:30, they're done by 9:30, they make kiddush, they can learn, they can relax, they can take a nap before Shabbos lunch, whatever it is, they're back before their kids get up. It's a lot of communities, they love the Hashkama minyan, the early minyan. But the origins of the Hashkama minyan were for people who had to go to work on Shabbos. They would have an early minyan in the shul, and then they'd take off their talis, fold it up, leave, go out to the trolley, go to work, come back afterwards in the summertime, spring and summer, and maybe in the fall, in time for Mincha, Shalosh, Shidduch, and Mariv, and for the Rav's Drasha, which would be in the afternoon. And that was Shabbos for many of these people. So they would be completely Shomer Shabbos as much as they could, and maybe even in their work, they would try to minimize the desecration of Shabbos, but that's what many of these people did. Those who didn't throw it away altogether in the Hudson, so to speak, but that's what many of them did. Now, the generation that saw Europe could do this, but their children couldn't. You can understand watching this how quickly Yiddishkeit can fall apart. How as a child, trying to grow up in America, trying to make in America, how you can't withstand such a thing. And we can understand, a great microcosm for this whole story is just look at the Jews who founded Hollywood. Hollywood was all founded by Jews. Every major production company was Jewish founded, Jewish owned, and they were all first or second generation Americans who were clearly trying to throw off the yokes of Torah Judaism in every way possible. Either because they were the ones who wanted to throw in the Hudson, or they were the second generation who saw their parents and this quasi trying to hold on to it. Again, can't blame them at all, but how do you, as a child, how do you grow from that? How do you embrace that? And the answer is most didn't. And this is, I always say, one of the best examples of this is the movie The Jazz Singer. Now, depending on your age, when I say jazz singer, you either think of Al Jolson, Jerry Lewis or Neil Diamond? I personally think of Neil Diamond because that's the one that was out when I was a kid. But take your pick. For each one of them, it was autobiographical. The movie was completely autobiographical. The movie's about a son of a chazan who wants to go off and become a jazz singer. He leaves his wife to marry a shiksa, like everything, and becomes famous. And the happy ending is when his father accepts him for having left his Jewish wife and marrying the non-Jewish woman, and he sings "Coming to America" in a big sold-out theater. Okay, but you know, the story is autobiographical for these people because the goal really of the kids at that point, there were no day schools. They were going to public schools, and the goal of the public school was the American melting pot philosophy, meaning that we're going to blend you all together. So you can't be separate. You can't be like your father or your grandfather. You got to be American now. And therefore, for so many, even though these 2.5 million Eastern European Jews, unlike their German cousins, they came over with Yiddishkeit. They came over with Judaism. Many of them. Again, some didn't, but most of them did. But it was almost an impossible situation. So when we look at the fact that Yiddishkeit was really able to rebuild from that in America and thrive in America. And now when you forget about what's going on in Eretz Yisrael, we're going to talk about that. But in America alone, I mean, there's more Torah learning in America today than ever before. We have amazing things like TorahAnytime.com, like Partners Cleveland. The fact that this grew out of the ashes of these first Jews who came to America, it is nothing short of miraculous. And we can't forget that. When we look at the American experience today, I am always reminded of the words of Rav Yaakov Emden, who said in the 18th century already, he said, the biggest miracle on the map of world history is not the splitting of the sea, not the miracles in the temple, not Mount Sinai, etc., etc. It's the fact that we're still here observing God's Torah. And if it was a miracle in the 18th century in Germany, all the more so today in America. The fact that we have not only survived, but we're thriving is absolutely miraculous. So anyone who says they don't believe in miracles doesn't open their eyes and look at the situation. Okay. One more topic I want to cover for tonight, and that is conservative Judaism. We talked in previous sessions about Reform Judaism, how Reform broke away from tradition, which they turned around and called Orthodox Judaism. That was a name thrown upon them by the Reformers. In America, we have the third division, so to speak, of the Jewish people, which became known as conservative Judaism. Now, where did it come from? In truth, it was really a response to the American experience that they were looking at the situation. They thought that the Judaism of Europe was dead, and therefore they thought it was going to be reform or nothing. So they saw that they had to do something to make a Judaism for the American experience. Now, the group which eventually becomes conservative Judaism, they weren't the only response. They weren't even the first, the JTS, which is the rabbinical school of the conservative movement. That wasn't even the first rabbinical school. The first yeshiva that was founded in the United States was founded actually in 1886. It was a yeshiva called Yeshivas Eitz Chaim in New York. It was modeled after Volozhin, after the Volozhin yeshiva, the European-style yeshiva. And that eventually developed into Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, which eventually became Yeshiva University. So really, if you ever ask a trivia question, what's the first yeshiva in America? It was Yeshiva University, called Eitz Chaim originally. The second was Yeshivas Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin in 1904, the Chaim Berlin Yeshiva in Brooklyn. The third was Masifta Tiferes Yerushalayim, MTJ, on the Lower East Side of New York, founded in 1907. That eventually became the yeshiva that Moshe Feinstein took the helm of. And all these yeshivas still exist today. So there were attempts to kind of rebuild Judaism for America. But the one we're going to talk more about those yeshivas in a later session after we talk about the war. But the one we're going to talk about today, or the attempt to deal with the American Jewish reality, is the conservative movement. Now, the conservative movement likes to claim their roots in Europe because, they don't want to say that they were founded in America in 1896 or whatever it is by far the youngest approach to Judaism, because with that you have the question of, okay, well, if you're right, well, where were you since Mount Sinai? So they at least try and, hang their ink or hang their hat on something a little bit earlier. So they claim as their intellectual forefather, Rabbi Zechariah Frankel, who was the rabbi of the Kingdom of Saxony in 1836 and was the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau in 1854. And yes, he was someone who was involved in the concept of Wissenschaft Judaism, the science of Judaism, the sort of historical look at Judaism as opposed to religious look at Judaism, and he was controversial, and he butted heads with Shlomo Raphael Hirsch. That is all true, but he was about as similar to today's conservative rabbi or conservative Jew as I am to an astronaut, right? And his practice was completely observant, davened 3 times a day, put on tefillin, kept Shabbos, didn't use a microphone, didn't use a car, didn't have mixed seating in a synagogue, none of that. But a lot of his philosophical ideas were not that different than the philosophical ideas that led to the founding of the conservative movement. So he is regarded as the intellectual forefather of the conservative movement. Okay. 1886, New York City. There's a group of rabbis, most notably Rabbi Henry Pereira Menendez, who was the rabbi of a Sephardic congregation, and Rabbi Bernard Jackman, who actually was ordained by the Breslov Jewish Theological Seminary, but considered himself firmly Orthodox. Henry Scheinenberg, who got together and came up with the concept that they had to develop a rabbinical school to make the American rabbi for the American people. Now, interestingly enough, the same group that founds JTS in 1886 will also found the Orthodox Union in 1898, the OU, right? The OU that we see with all the kashrus and NCSY and their campus work and all the good work they do. Well, that was also founded by the same exact people who founded JTS in the same exact location with the same exact goal in mind, trying to make an American Jewish experience. Now, they ran their idea by the leader of world Jewry at that point, who was none other than Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Schechter in Europe, in Kovna. Now, interestingly enough, the first yeshiva, Eitz Chaim, eventually changed its name to Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, named after him when he passes away. Now, they wrote him a letter saying they want to make this new rabbinical school, and they said from the beginning, we're not modeling this after European yeshiva. We're not trying to make European Talmidei Chachamim and scholars. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to make Aaron. We're trying to make Aaron a Kohen. We're not trying to make Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, what do they mean by that? They said that Moshe was the rabbinic leader, the spiritual leader of the Jewish people. Who was Aaron? Aaron was the Ohev Shalom, V'rodev Shalom. He was the one who loved peace and ran after peace. Ohev Esabrios Mekarvim the Torah. He loved people and he brought them close to the Torah. He said that's what we're trying to do. And we're not even going to call our ordination smicha. We're going to call it. We're not going to call them rabbis. We're going to call them teachers and preachers. And their goal is to be the number two to the scholars, and let the scholars still be the scholars, and they'll know they're not the scholars, and they'll just try and reach out to the people and bring them close to the Torah. Rav Yitzchak Elchanan responded and said, I can't endorse this. Why? Because if you have a base medrash, if you make an academy where you want to create an Aaron, we want to create an Aaron, a Kohen, an Aaron, but you don't have a Moshe present, pretty soon, Aaron is going to come to think of himself as Moshe. In other words, the Aarons are not going to be number twos anymore. They're going to think they're number one. And you're not going to have that link to true Torah scholarship. And once you do that, your connection to Torah falls apart. They didn't listen, they didn't get the Haskama, they didn't get the appropriation from Yitzchak Elchanan, and a lot of what he said in that letter is what will play out with the conservative movement. But it doesn't happen overnight. They founded the school, and for the first 15 years or so, it's a fledgling school without too much success. And then in 1902, this was after really the first wave of that Eastern European immigration had happened, and the Germans, as we said, didn't want to mix with these Eastern Europeans, but they felt like they felt they had to do something because they were of the same kin, they were at least Jews, so they wanted to make a framework to help these Eastern European Jews become Americanized. And they knew it wasn't going to happen through the Reform movement, so their philanthropist, most notably a man by the name of Jacob Schiff, and they were all Reform themselves, but they donated $500,000 to the Jewish Theological Seminary on condition that a scholar from Europe by the name of Solomon Schechter would come in and become the chancellor. Now, Solomon Schechter himself was also a scholar of note, an observant Jew his entire life. He was actually a Chabad chassid from his roots. He wasn't much of a chassid at this point, but he was a Chabadsker. That was his lineage. That's how he was raised. And Schechter comes in, and he's really one who gives a certain amount of form to the conservative movement. Now, his philosophy that he talked about was Catholic Israel. Now, Catholic, the word Catholic, when it was really created by Constantine the Great, when he took over the Christian church, and the idea of Catholic was to be all-encompassing. Now, what Constantine meant by that is all-encompassing, meaning you'll follow my type of Christianity and not anyone else's, right? That's what Catholic meant to him, and that's really what Catholicism means to Catholics. Only Catholicism and nothing else. But Schechter seemingly meant something different when he said Catholic Israel. He said that, and now, by the way, it was terrible PR to call it Catholic Israel. When you're starting a movement that's moving away from the traditional movement, call it Catholic Israel, not such a good idea. But anyways, the basic idea was that Jewish law is formed and evolves based on the behavior of the Jewish people. Now, that's not what we believe. We believe that the Talmud is the source of Jewish law, and we're supposed to look into the Talmud and figure out how it applies nowadays. Schechter's idea was seemingly that no, even if it's not exactly linked to the Talmud, it evolves based on the behavior of the Jewish people. In 1913, the United Synagogue of America was founded. And then it was known as the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, and it was something that consisted of 22 communities. Now, mind you, at this point, there's not a clear line in the sand, if you will, between what we call Orthodox and what we call conservative. Conservative was a response to reform. Is it to say they're trying to reform it, we're trying to conserve it? In other words, we want to keep traditional. And we're going to see for the next 50 years, there's a lot of tit for tat between what we'll now call modern Orthodoxy and conservative Judaism. In fact, Menendez, one of the founders of JTS, at the time when United Synagogue was founded, had his first major disagreement with Schechter because Schechter insisted that any alumnus of the Jewish Theological Seminary could be on the managing board for the United Synagogue of America, and that would include several people who Menendez himself considered not so devout, and who sanctioned things like mixed seating and their synagogues, and therefore Menendez at that point said, now Menendez was the president of the OU at this point, and he at that point refused to join United Synagogues of America. Now, what happens at this point is there were those who were members of the OU and the Rabbinical Association of America, the Rabbinical Council of America, and those who were also member of the conservative United Synagogue, and it really went back and forth. But it gets shaken out as the years go on. Even though initially you would have United Synagogue affiliated synagogues that would have graduates from Yeshiva University, and you would have OU affiliated synagogues that had graduates from JTS, and that's what you had in these early years. Now, Schechter really said himself that he aimed not to create a new party, but to consolidate an old one. So it's very interesting that in the beginning, the full goals of Schechter, JTS, United Synagogue, all these things, was not to move away from traditional Judaism, but just find the best way to package traditional Judaism for the American experience. Now, so much so was this crossover in these early years that in 1926 there were intense discussions about actually combining, well, it wasn't called Yeshiva University yet, but Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan with the Jewish Theological Seminary. Ultimately, the lay leadership tanked it, but the administrative leadership wanted it. They said they were close enough that they were aiming for the same goals of trying to create an American Jewish traditional experience. They should merge together and make one institution. All I have to say is, had that happened, the Jewish experience in America would have looked much different than it does today. I don't know how different, I don't know what it would look like, but it definitely would have looked different. Okay, 1915, Schechter dies. And the first generations of his students really keep the non-sectarian legacy going and the commitment to traditional Judaism. But at that point, there were already others who had started to make the changes, including removing the mechitzas from the synagogue, mixed seating, and you started to slowly but surely see the allowances of ignoring of Jewish law that the conservative movement became a little bit more famous for it later. Now, interestingly, even though by the 1940s, I think just about every single conservative synagogue had already removed its mechitza and had mixed seating, the main minyan of the Jewish Theological Seminary had a mechitza in it and davened a halachic davening until 1983, when Rav Saul Lieberman passed away, who was one of their main scholars. He is actually the son-in-law of the Nitziv, and he was the son-in-law of Rav Meir Berlin, who became Rav Meir Bar Ilan, who was the one that Bar Ilan University was named for. And as long as he was there, he insisted the davening be with the mechitza, according to halacha. It was only after he died in 83 they took out the mechitza. Now, it wouldn't be until after World War II that we would see the complete break between what we now call Orthodox Judaism and conservative Judaism. And that's when in 1948 the conservative movement institutionalized this concept of the break from halacha, where they said that no longer did their practices have to be based on the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch and Jewish law. And so that was the official 1948 line in the sand, but up until that point, really through for sure the 1930s and up until the 1940s, there was a lot of tit for tat between the two movements and as to how they would coexist together before they became totally separate movements or groups of people, if you were. Now, in post-war America, the movement explodes because a lot of these first generation, second generation Eastern European Jews, not just the ones that came before 1924, but the ones that are eventually allowed in after the war, well, they still want something that sort of looks and feels like European Jewry, which the service did, but they wanted a rabbi who spoke English. They wanted to give their children the American dream, and therefore it'll explode in post-war America. And we'll see that it'll reach its peak in about 1970, at which point it'll be about 40% of American Jewry and have over 2 million people. And, it's at that point, again, we're getting ahead of ourselves, we'll talk about this in subsequent sessions, but it's in that point, 1970, where we see the Orthodox community begin its comeback and begin its growth. And from that point, the conservative movement completely dwindles to the point where today it's less than 1 million members, and it is the third of the three major movements. With, if we want to look at world Jewry, the Orthodox movement is, if you call it a movement, is the largest with about 2.5 million affiliates worldwide. Number two, we have Reform with about 2 million affiliates worldwide. Problem with Reform is because how they count a Jew is a little bit different according to halacha, so 2 million probably isn't really 2 million. But then number three is conservative. And this is all what's going on in America before the onset of World War II, and it's going to be in this experience that we see the Holocaust start and really the whole world turn upside down. Even as tumultuous as it is right now, it won't even hold a candle to what we're going to talk about starting next week when we talk about the beginning of World War II and the Holocaust in Europe. And as depressing as it is, we have to remember this concept from the Kloisenberger Rebbe that it's our curses, it's happened, and now we are expecting the blessings of the Torah to take place. And I look forward to living through all of that with you. I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you again next week.